Good evening again. My name is Dan Bridges. It is my honor to serve this community as its superintendent of schools. A little later this evening, you'll hear from our featured speaker, Dr. Jonathan Singer. Tonight is our 37th either Future Focus or Focus 203 session. Focus 203 comes as a result of feedback we heard from the community throughout the Future Focus 203 community engagement process. Participants throughout Future Focus commented that they appreciated hearing about our school district, our celebrations, our challenges, and our vision. Focus 203 provides an interactive forum where we gather to engage in the meaningful dialogue and discussion on topics of mutual interest to generate ideas and suggestions that ultimately strengthen our learning community. Topics we have discussed range from programs of study to finances, from facilities to digital learning. We've listened to your feedback about the school day, and we've listened to your input on our social emotional learning plan. Each of our community engagement sessions have been important to the school district and provided input to help shape our school district. While each session and the feedback we have received has been important, tonight may be the most important session for our community. This evening, we are here to engage in an important conversation regarding suicide. One death by suicide is too many. When a community has experienced more than one death, it's even more difficult for us to understand. It's important for our community to come together to engage in a conversation about how we can collectively work to support each other and our entire community. Many of you have attended a Focus 203 session in the past, and you're familiar with our process. I could see by a show of hands who has attended a Focus 203 or Future Focus session. Hands up. Great. Welcome back. There's many of you in here who have not attended one of our community engagement sessions. And for those of you who are new to our series, I'd like to take a minute to explain our format. Each of our sessions follows a timed agenda. Each session starts with an informational presentation about the topic chosen for the workshop, and tonight it's a conversation about suicide, followed by a small group work activity giving you the opportunity to respond to the presentation. It's important to note that these sessions will not be conducive to the format of an open forum or debate. They are work sessions focused on results and reaching consensus and providing input. We want to maximize our time to be as productive as possible while still allowing for the free exchange of ideas. The intent is to involve a large number of people that is as representative of the community as possible. And I commend you and thank you for giving up your time to be here with us this evening. Here's how the process will be documented. When you arrived, you should have received a packet of information. And in that packet, among other things, you'll find a copy of the presentation. Following our presentations today, we'll prepare a summary of responses from each of the small groups worksheets and an executive summary reflecting the collective work of all participants of this session. All Focus 203 information, materials, and documents will be posted on the district website. Go to www.naperville203.org to receive district news and updates. And if you haven't already done so, please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram to stay connected to the district. We also have a mobile app that you can download from Google Play Store or the Apple App Store and search Naperville 203 to download that app. We know that your time is very valuable, and we will honor the 2-hour time commitment for each session. Each session will end at the time promised or earlier. We have planned a pretty tight agenda for each of the sessions, and we have a lot of information to cover in a very short period of time this evening. As such, it'll be important for us not to interrupt the presenter with questions. We know you will have questions, and we want to capture those in a way that is most effective. Therefore, we request your patience with our plan and procedure for questions and comments tonight. There will be questions or comments that may or may not be directly related to the topic being studied. So we've placed some I have a question comment form on each of your tables. If you have a question or comment and we are not able to respond during the small group time during the second half of our evening, please complete one of the forms and turn it into us at the end of this session. You can also call or send us an email, and we'll have the appropriate person on staff respond in a timely manner. Now let's move to our session. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Jonathan Singer, a clinical social worker, researcher, and associate professor of social work at Loyola University Chicago, to lead us in this conversation. Dr. Singler's clinical practice and research focuses on family-based interventions, suicide, and cyberbullying in youth. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, National Public Radio, and other national print and radio outlets. He is a frequent guest, expert in local news in youth suicide and cyberbullying. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Singer.
Good evening. Good evening. Let's do that again. Good evening. All right. I'm really, really honored, very honored to be here today. We're going to talk about, make sure I get this right. Okay. So we're going to be talking about myths and facts around suicide. We're going to be talking about risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors. And we're also going to be talking about resources and interventions for suicide prevention. Let's start with some myths and facts. And that's as fancy as my slides get. So the first myth is that people who are suicidal are weak. What's true is that people are suicidal in spite of enormous strength. I found this image on the internet, and I think it does a great job of illustrating and saying what this myth and fact embodies. And it says, "Do not confuse my bad days as a sign of weakness. Those are actually the days I'm fighting the hardest." Another myth, all adolescents think about, is that right? There we go. All adolescents think about suicide. What's true is that not all adolescents think about suicide. Research done by Matthew Knock and his colleagues out of Harvard found that the lifetime prevalence of serious thoughts of suicide, that means people thinking, I want to kill myself, I want to die, not, I have thought about the concept of suicide or I've heard people talk about suicide, but I've had serious thoughts of killing myself, is about 12%. That means that 88% of people did not have thoughts of suicide when they were growing up. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why it's important is because when we provide services, we want to make sure that we are targeting our services to the right people, to the people that need to talk to somebody about what's going on in their lives, somebody that can help them find the reasons for living. And we want to make sure that we're targeting those resources appropriately. Another reason is because if we tell students everybody thinks about killing themselves, then suddenly it's not something that they're thinking, oh, well, wait, maybe I should go talk to somebody about this, because like literally everybody thinks about it. And that's not the message we want to send. We want to say, if you're having thoughts of suicide, there are lots of reasons why you wouldn't talk to let me back up. There are lots of reasons why you wouldn't talk to adults about things going on in your lives. Suicide's not one of those. That's always something that you should be able to talk to an adult about. Another myth. If I ask about suicide, I will put the idea in someone's head. What's true is that asking somebody about suicide will not make them suicidal. Now, how do we know this? Madeline Gould is an epidemiologist out of New York. For years, she's been doing research on suicide risk. About 15 years ago, she was setting up a study where she was surveying middle school students about a whole bunch of things, including suicide risk. When she submitted her protocol to the Institutional Review Board, that's the ethics review to make sure that people who participate in research aren't harmed by the research, the IRB came back and said, we love the study, but you can't ask questions about suicide. And she said, why not? And they said, well, these are middle school students. And if you say if you've had serious thoughts of killing yourself in the last couple of weeks, then you're going to make these kids want to kill themselves. And she said, that's not true. And they said, well, how do you know? And she said, well, we've been doing this for years and we know. And they said, well, where's the research? And she said, well, there isn't any. So this is where Maddie Gould's genius came in. She created a study within the study. What she did was she asked questions about level of distress and a couple of other things that students had to answer before they answered the questions on the survey. And then they answered questions after they finished the survey, and then they answered those same questions 2 days later. And so what they were able to show, or what they found, was that students who reported, yes, I've had thoughts of killing myself, they reported higher levels of distress before the survey started than after they finished the survey, right? So their level of distress decreased after answering questions about suicide. Students that did not report having had thoughts of suicide, their level of distress did not change. And in fact, everybody had the same level of distress at the end of the survey as they did 2 days later. So what this study did for the first time ever, and it's been replicated subsequently in different populations, so not just kids, but also folks in the military, adults in the general population, is the study showed that not only do you not increase risk by asking kids about suicide, but that for those who are thinking about suicide, it actually decreases distress. And it doesn't do anything for kids that are not already thinking about it. So that's a 2005 study. This image is the cover of my book, and I'm not showing it to promote my book. I'm showing it because the reason why we chose this image is because screening for suicide risk is an essential component of suicide prevention. Because if you look at the picture, there's that orange table, right? There's that one table that's different from the other. You don't know who's suicidal. You can't tell by looking at them. When the first suicide prevention books were published, school-based suicide prevention books were published in the 80s, do you know what they had chapters on? Heavy metal lyrics, Dungeons and Dragons. The assumption was that you would know which kids were suicidal based on the music they listened to and the games that they played. We know that's not true anymore. And so Maddie's research is one of the ways that we're able to confidently say we should screen kids and identify who's at risk, knowing that we're not going to put other kids at higher risk. So, another myth. Suicide is a white people problem. Fact, suicide kills people of all ethnicities. These are data for youth 0 to 24 across the United States. And what we see is that American Indian, Alaska Native have the highest rate of suicide, 8.86 per 100,000. Next is white students, then Asian Pacific Islander, Black, and there's a category for Hispanic. And for those of you who are researchers or interested in data, there's an asterisk next to it because it's not a pure category because of the way that data are collected through the federal government. You have white Hispanic, white non-Hispanic, and so some of these numbers are spread out throughout these other categories. But the basic idea behind this graph is to show that suicide is something that is present in all ethnicities. And so it doesn't matter what the makeup of your school is, it doesn't matter what the makeup of your community is. You have to talk about suicide, and you have to think that it's an option. And so you have to address it. Another myth, if somebody really wants to die by suicide, there's nothing I can do about it. Fact, suicide is preventable. Even those at the highest risk for suicide still have part of them that wants to live. Now, before I go into details about this, let me point out a really important caveat. This is a message for everybody whose job it is to keep kids safe and healthy. You don't want to have teachers and social workers and nurses coming into school saying, I'm going to do my best, but at the end of the day, if somebody wants to kill themselves, there's nothing I can do about it. You don't want to have that. You want to have somebody say, I'm going to do everything that I possibly can because I believe that every suicide is preventable. The flip is that after a suicide death, you don't focus on, well, you didn't do everything you could have. You focus on the sadness, the loss, the answering the questions why. I should say the unanswerable question, why? And you say, we're going to do everything we can do now to support those that have lost a loved one and figure out how this is not going to happen to any other family, to any other school, to any other community. Because we have to believe that suicides are preventable. Suicide is selfish. That's a myth that you often hear associated with adults more so than kids. And you'll hear it whenever you see a story about a parent, particularly a parent with kids that has died by suicide. What's true is that people who are suicidal often feel like they're burdens to others, and they see staying alive as selfish, and dying by suicide as giving a reprieve to their loved ones. My colleague, Stacy Friedenthal out of Denver, has a blog post that says, that makes the analogy that dying by suicide is a lot like getting swept up in a tornado. You wouldn't blame anybody who was swept up in a tornado, right? Because when you're in a suicidal crisis, everything's going so fast and it's so out of control that it's like being swept up in a tornado. I'm going to take a sip of water. So raise your hand if you remember hearing about the suicides in Palo Alto, California. Okay. So Palo Alto is a very affluent area. There's the educational system is excellent. There's a lot of there are a lot of folks with a lot of resources. And there was a period of time where news reports were coming out that kids were killing themselves. And it was such a big story that the CDC went in to do a study of what was going on. And what they found was that Palo Alto had the highest youth suicide rate in the county. 14.1 per 100,000 residents between 2003 and 2015. And that was the time period of the report. And the 2008 to 2015 was the time of these suicides. Santa Clara County's overall youth suicide rate was 5.1 per 100,000. And it was similar to the state's. And this suicide rate was actually lower than the national average. So one of the things that this report points to is that when there are suicides in a school district, people focus in on the suicides that are happening, and it can feel like it is a bigger problem than it is if you look at national trends. That is not, please do not get me wrong, that is not to minimize any of the suicide deaths that happen in that area at that time. What it does say is that in an area like Palo Alto, which some people have made analogies to Naperville because of the resources, the quality of education, and other things, that this time period where there were a series of suicide deaths was something that, in the big scheme of things, when you looked nationally, actually didn't rise to the level of extending beyond national averages. I'm not saying that there's a parallel here that we can point to, but I think it's an important thing for us to remember about what's going on in the region, and to know that other areas have also been grappling with this same issue. So there's something else that's important to know about death. And one of the things is that this is a graph that looks at 3 types of death for kids 10 to 14. The solid line is motor vehicle traffic deaths. And that line in 1999 was about 4.5 per 100,000. Down below, you have homicides and suicides were about even, just about 1.2 per 100,000. Since 1999, we've done an amazing job of reducing traffic fatalities in general. But in this graph, we can see amongst kids 10 to 14. We've also done a pretty good job of keeping the homicide rate from going up. But if you look at the thick dotted line, what you can see is that starting in 2008, you have an upward trend for suicide. And by 2014, there was no difference between the rates of suicide and the rates of traffic vehicle deaths in kids 10 to 14. So I share this for a couple of reasons. One, because it puts suicide, this change in suicide rates in context. It also speaks to the fact that when we put our minds to it and we put our resources to it, we have been effective in reducing death rates amongst kids. And I would argue that this is something that we absolutely should commit to when it comes to suicide. So the 2015 statistics on suicide. Suicide's the second leading cause of death. In 2015, there were 5,904 suicide deaths for kids 0 to 24. For every suicide, there were 918 suicide attempts. And approximately 17% of kids in high school reported having at least one serious thought of suicide. Now, if you're thinking back to that 12% number that I mentioned earlier, that has to do with looking at something over a year-long period versus a lifetime period. And you have you have some of the same kids year after year, which would explain the difference between the 12% and the 17%. One of the things that I want to point out about these 3 bullet points is that we have an annual suicide rate for youth of about 5.6 per 100,000 youth. So if you remember the bars, you had 8 point something for American Indian, you had 5.6 for white, you had 3.4, 3.4. If you average all those out, it's about 5.6 per 100,000 youth. Among youth, these are just some stats per day: 15 suicides, 13,850 suicide attempts, and 49,000 kids who have serious thoughts of killing themselves every day. And the top 3 methods of suicide are firearms, suffocation, so that's hanging, and poisoning, and that's typically with pills. The firearms number is a really important number to think about. Firearms account, if you look at all suicides, they account for 50% of all suicides. if we wanted to reduce the suicide rate by 50% next week, in a magical world, we would get rid of all the guns. Now, this is not a Second Amendment issue. I'm not talking about people's rights. And it's not going to happen because we live in America and nobody's going to take away your guns. But what I'm saying is that if we want to reduce the suicide rate amongst youth and amongst adults, what we have to do is we have to think about the access that people have to lethal means. And one of the lethal means that people have access to are guns. So if you're a gun owner, you always need to think about who has access to my gun, who has access to the bullets, do they know how to use them, and is there anybody that I know, and this could be kid or adult, because we've got to remember adults have a higher suicide rate than kids, that would want to use my gun to end their life. And I don't think any gun owner wants to have that on them. So as we think about suicide prevention and risk reduction, we have to think about how people are killing themselves. And one of the most important ways is with guns. Now, males die by suicide 4 times as often as females, and that's because males tend to use guns. Females actually attempt suicide 3 to 4 times as often as males. But the reasons why they don't die is because they use less lethal means. We've seen an increase in suicide rates amongst teenage girls, and one of the reasons is because they've started using more lethal means. It's not because there's been a change in the amount of suicidal thoughts, right? It's because the means that they're using has changed. Rural youth are 2 times more likely to die by suicide than urban youth. And when you control for all other factors, it comes down to access to guns. And the last thing that I'm going to say is that all of these statistics, as heartbreaking as they are, they're probably underreported. Meaning it's probably worse than what I'm telling you. And the reason why it's probably worse is because, or why it's underreported, is that the only way we know how somebody dies is what's on the death certificate. And if somebody dies and they are able to convince the medical examiner or the coroner, hey, please don't put suicide on there. Accidental overdose, hit by a bus, anything, just accident. And they put it down as an accidental death, we won't be able to count it. It's the same reason why when we think about, when you hear statistics about suicide rates for LGBTQ youth, we actually don't know any of those numbers because you don't have sexual orientation or gender identity on a death certificate, right? And so all of those numbers are just guesses at this point. Now, if we get closer to home, in DuPage County, since 2001, we can see that there is a trend that mirrored what was going on nationally in terms of suicides in youth. 2001 to 2005, there was sort of a relative decline in suicide rates nationally. Starting in 2005 in DuPage County, you see a slight upward trend. And then between 2014 and 2015, there was a huge increase. Now, one of the challenging things about the research behind suicide is because it's a low base rate behavior, meaning that I don't know how many kids there are in each of those years, but that number is actually really small compared to the total number of kids. It's really hard to pinpoint what's going on and to find patterns when you have those few numbers. And honestly, I would like that to be our problem. I would like us to have so few that it's hard for us to find patterns. I lived in Philadelphia for a number of years, and I was on the child death review, the non-homicide child death review. And we would review all of the suicide deaths that happened in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is the 5th largest city in the nation. And we had a situation where we would have 15 one year, 20 another year, 22, 11. So we'd go up and down. We could never find a pattern. We looked and we looked and we looked. We could not find a pattern. And this is one of the challenges with reducing suicide death rates amongst youth. Now, this is DuPage County total deaths by suicide, so this is all folks. So if you think about the numbers I just showed you, that was 0 to 24, and this includes the 0 to 24. But you can see that the total number of deaths for adults is much higher. And you can also see that there's a slight increase as you go up 2013, 14, 15, 16. Now, how do we think about understanding suicide risk, preventing suicide? What are some of the basic concepts? So there's this idea of risk factors. Risk factors are things that are present in a group of people that are more likely to be present in those folks than other folks. So for example, if we think about risk factors for suicide, we think about the folks that have died by suicide, and we look at all the things that are going on in their lives. And the things that are more present in the lives of the folks that died by suicide, those become risk factors. Protective factors are things that protect from risk. So if a risk factor for suicide is social isolation, then a protective factor is something that protects from being socially isolated. You can't have a protective factor that is not connected to a risk factor and have it actually be a protective factor. And I say this because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, religion is a protective factor. Religion is not a protective factor in and of itself. Religion is a protective factor if what it does is it protects from some of the risks that are contributing to suicide. So for example, if you have a kid who is at risk for social isolation, becomes involved in a religious community and finds connection and finds meaning, then that becomes a protective factor. Warning signs are different from risk factors because warning signs have to do with the person that is right in front of you. It's kind of like heart attacks, right? So there are risk factors for heart disease, sedentary lifestyle, high cholesterol diets, and then there are the warning signs for a heart attack, chest pains, shooting pains down the arm. Like those are the warning signs for a heart attack. So we're going to talk about the warning signs for suicide, which are not the same as the risk factors for suicide. And then we're going to talk about resilience. And resilience is one of these concepts that we've talked about in school settings for a long time, but is actually something that is incredibly applicable to talking about suicide. Because these are things that indicate that you are performing better than what people might expect. So you can have risk and protective factors at all levels. So here we have the standard concentric circle view of the world. You've got society, community, relationships like family, and then you've got individual levels. If you look here at the society level, you can see systemic barriers to care. That's a society level risk factor. It puts people at greater risk for suicide if they can't access services. And so the associated protective factor might be mental health parity, where you find that services for mental health services are being covered at the same rate and in the same way as physical health problems. If you go down and you look at relationships, interpersonal conflict is a risk factor for suicide. A protective factor would be supportive relationships. So if you're talking with a kid that says, I always fight with my parents. They're harsh and critical. They don't understand me. If there's a way that you can work with the family so that they might still disagree with each other, but there's a shift in how supportive the kid feels like the parents are, then that protects against suicide risk. I won't go through every one of these or else we'll be here till midnight. Warning signs. So these are the warning signs that I was talking about, like the warning signs for a heart attack. These are the things that if you see these in somebody standing in front of you, then you need to act. Talking about or making plans for suicide. Expressing hopelessness about the future. Displaying severe or overwhelming emotional pain or distress. Showing worrisome behavioral cues or marked change in behavior, particularly in the presence of these above warning signs. So, it's particularly significant if there's withdrawal from or change in social connections or situations, recent increased agitation or irritability, anger or hostility that seems out of character or out of context, and changes in sleep. Now, if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, yes, any one of those could be my teenager at any given point, then you're right. And this is one of the things that's challenging. When you look at this and you say, what is this, how do any of these fit in with this idea of talking about suicide, making plans for suicide, being hopeless about the future? That's when you really need to start worrying. So yes, there might be change in sleep. And if you ask your kid, so have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? And that might not be the first question you want to start out with in the morning. But if you lead up to it, how are you doing? You haven't been talkative lately. Things have changed. That thing that you were really interested in last month, I don't see you doing anymore. So-and-so that you used to hang out with, you're not hanging out with them. And then you lead into questions that are in the domain of suicide. Are you feeling like life's not worth living? Like things aren't going to get better? Are there things that you are worried about that you don't think are ever going to be resolved? Do you think that people would be better off if you weren't around? Have you ever had thoughts of killing yourself? If you ask these questions and you get the answers, in the context of these other things, changes in sleep, not engaging in the same activities they used to, sense of hopelessness, then this is when you definitely need to act. And acting on them can be a whole bunch of different things. It could be calling your primary care provider, calling your neighbor, calling another professional, right? If this happens in school, there are all sets of protocols that schools go through in order to address these. So that's the difference between risk factors and warning signs. Now, resilience. When I first learned about resilience, resilience was explained to me like it was this little magical spark in a kid that came out of nowhere that helped this kid overcome insurmountable odds. And it was usually talked about in the context of a kid in a really distressed neighborhood that managed to get to Harvard, even though nobody in their family had ever graduated 6th grade, right? That is not a very particularly useful definition of resilience, because who knows what that magic spark is. I like Michael Unger's definition a little bit better. What he says is that in the context of exposure to significant adversity, resilience is both the capacity of individuals to navigate their way to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that sustain their well-being, and their capacity individually and collectively to negotiate for these resources to be provided and experienced in culturally meaningful ways. So what this does is it takes resilience from being a magic spark that somehow shows up in an individual, and it makes it about community resources and people who are able to help others access those community resources in ways that are meaningful. So, resilience is about helping people navigate cultural spaces, diverse curriculums, experiences at schools, housing, employment, issues of social justice around laws and anti-discrimination, addressing power and control, identity issues, relationships, right? So these are the things that you want people to be able to navigate. And this is what it looks like. You have these cultural identification and cultural practices, right? You have cohesion, a sense of engagement with others, attitudes towards belonging, spirituality, access to material resources, such as the awareness that these resources are available, right? And that there's opportunities, and particularly in the case of suicide, there's opportunities for access to health care and services that would be provided to folks at risk for suicide. Social justice. What are your rights? What is it that you should be able to do in this society? Power and control. Attribution style. And this is both internal and external. Ideas of efficacy. Not only do I believe I can do something, but that by doing something, I will be able to affect change. Issues of identity, right? Self-worth, self-esteem, strengths, relationships. What are the qualities of attachment to peers and caregivers? One of the beautiful things about attachment, and we think of attachment as a biological instinct, right? It's why we like seeing babies, pictures of babies and cats on the internet. We see them and we're like, oh, right? Something gets triggered for us, something internal. It's an instinct. And one of the great things about attachment is that you can earn attachment. You can develop attachment. So even kids that seem to have poor attachment to parents and to peers, that's something that can be addressed and that can be developed. So resilience is as much about helping people to negotiate these things as it is navigating their way around all of these. And so when we think about creating schools where we're addressing risk factors, protective factors, warning signs, and resilience, we're talking about school settings where there is the presence of resources and people that can help those in need to access those resources in ways that are meaningful to them. And that is much more hopeful and much more practical than a little magic spark that suddenly shows up in somebody. So here's some tips for parents around the idea of suicide risk. The first one is to make your teen sleep. I know. This is a tough one. Talk with your teen. And talking with your teen also means being available to listen to your teen, even when your teen is not interested in talking to you. Talking with teens oftentimes looks like saying, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. It's not about saying, oh, well, let's fix this problem, or what are you going to do about that? It's not about problem solving for them. It's about providing the space to hear more about what's going on. You want to model mental health treatment. Our kids see us and they see us stressed. I have 3 kids. I have 6-year-old twin boys and a 9-year-old daughter. And they see me when I'm working late at night. My daughter will say, did you get to bed before midnight? And I'll say, no, not last night. She's like, you got to do it, Dad. Like, she knows, right? So modeling mental health treatment, modeling taking care of ourselves is one of the things that we can do to help our kids, especially when we're worried about suicide risk. Want the best for your child, not for your child to be the best. I love this because sometimes we confuse being the best with what we want for our kids, right? And I get it. I get it. I have that impulse in me. When my daughter tells me about something she's doing in school, I want to be like, so did you win? Really, how many other people got all those right? Right? There's that sort of competitive thing. But that's not actually wanting the best for my child. And it's healthier to want the best for my child. And for my daughter, it might not actually be to set her up with the expectation that she always gets every vocabulary word correct. Because I didn't. It's you and the teachers versus your teen, not you and your teen versus the teachers. So what does this mean? This means that particularly when we're in states of crisis and there are things going on in the schools, particularly after a tragedy like a suicide death, that one of the best things that we can do is we can partner with the teachers in our district, where we can be adults that are on the same page to support children, rather than being partners with our children against the school. That doesn't help our kids to feel like the school is a safe space that has their best interest in mind. Now, I'm not saying that you need to gang up against your teenager and be like, Mrs. Smith, come here. We're going to make my kid feel really bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying figure out what it is that your kid needs and be a team with the teachers. Getting a pet. So in the aftermath of a crisis, people have known this for years, but it's taken the world of psychology a long time to catch up. Pets are really therapeutic. Pets are the kinds of things that people, they can feel unconditional love from. They can care for them. They can feel like they have another family member. Sometimes they can get into arguments about things, and it's all about the pet, which can diffuse the tension in the family because it's actually about something else. And the last thing is to keep calm. And I know this is tough when there's a crisis, but taking care of yourself and doing your deep breathing and doing whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself will help you to be there for your kids. So tips for communities. Collect better data. Was anybody looking at those data charts that I was showing and saying, but what about, and you had questions and you wanted more information and you wanted to dig a little deeper and you wanted to know, well, what's going on in Naperville? What about this area? What do we know about this? I can tell you that I showed you what we have. That's what we have. So we need to do a better job at collecting data. And that means that if schools are saying, we're going to do suicide prevention curricula, we're going to do prevention programs, parents have to say, great, do it, collect data. Let's find out how many kids are thinking about killing themselves. Let's find out how many kids have identified reasons for living. Let's get these data so that we actually know what we're talking about. Invest in early intervention. And I'm talking about like 0 to 3. I'm talking about kindergarten. There are only 2 suicide prevention programs that have been shown to reduce suicide attempts in kids. One of them is Signs of Suicide, and the other one is a program called the Good Behavior Game. Good Behavior Game is for first and second graders to help them adjust to being students in schools. It's not a suicide prevention program. But there was a study, and I won't go into the details, but there was a study that found that kids that went through the Good Behavior Game actually ended up having lower suicide attempt rates than kids that did not, accounting for every other factor that you could think of. And so starting early and investing in early intervention is essential if we want to reduce risk for suicide when it comes to middle and high school. Commit to minimum levels of care. Now minimum levels of care is when you're talking about Having options that are something other than hospitalization. If our answer to every kid that's at risk for suicide is hospitalizing them, then we're not doing the kids a favor and we're not doing the community a favor. It's expensive, and for the most part, it doesn't work very well. So we need to have more outpatient community mental health. We need to have more resources in the community. Maximize least restrictive environments. When kids are sent to these most restrictive environments, we want to make sure that they're getting the treatment that they have, so that, or the treatment that they need, so that when they're released into the community, there are resources that are there that can actually maximize what they have learned and what they have dealt with inside the hospital settings. And then the last thing is to improve collaborations. Mental health, outpatient mental health, is its own silo. Schools are their own silos. Juvenile justice is its own silo. All of these systems are their own silos. We need to make sure that there's better collaboration so that people are not getting fatigued about addressing the same issues over and over again. Now for schools, conduct universal screening. I've talked about why that's important. Collaborate with parents and communities. Aspire to zero suicides. There's an initiative in healthcare called the Zero Suicide Initiative. And the idea is that suicide should be a never event in healthcare settings. I want that to be a never event in school settings as well. And what that means is that we have to train staff to recognize and respond to suicide risk. And we also have to recognize mistakes as learning opportunities. And what this means is that when you have administrators have a responsibility for providing support to the staff. And staff have a responsibility to say, you know what? I didn't do this according to protocol. I did this thing that we thought was going to work, and it didn't seem to work. And there needs to be a culture where people can talk about that and say, we're going to learn from that, and we're going to do better next time. I mean, that's what we do with our kids, right? That's what we want to do with all of our systems, whether it's healthcare or school. And the last thing is to care for staff. When there's been a suicide death, everybody is struggling. And if we're not able to care for staff in schools, they're not going to be able to care for the students. And they're not going to be able to respond to the parents in the community. Thank you.
Okay, it's time for us to move to our small group activity. And the purpose of the small group work is to gather community input to help inform the work of the school district. This time I'm going to walk you through the working agreements and instructions for each small group task. Before we begin on the task, it's important that we review some working together agreements for each group. The agreements will ensure the conversation remains focused on the needs of the students and allows for the voice at the table for all of the members to be heard. As this topic is emotional for many, it will be important that we assume positive intent from all table members and engage in open, honest dialogue designed to strengthen the supports and protective factors in our community. When you arrived this evening, each of you received a small group work activity sheet in your packet, and it looks something like this. You will use this document to capture your individual thoughts and reactions. At each table, we're going to ask that you select a recorder and a facilitator. The facilitator should facilitate the discussions, keep the group focused and on task so the work is completed in the allotted time, and will report the group's information if time permits. Once group work begins, the recorder is responsible for completing the information requested on the pink sheet that is in the center of the table. We may have added some tables, so we'll have to check to make sure we have a pink sheet on some of the new tables. Be sure to complete the information in the box in the upper right corner, and then this worksheet will be collected at the conclusion of the session and used to create a summary of the input that can be given to district administration. As you begin your work, here's just a few reminders. Recorders, please make sure the information committed to the pink worksheet reflects the collective decisions, general agreement, or consensus of everyone at the table, not just the opinion of one or two members. Facilitators, monitor your time and progress to make sure you complete your work in the allotted time, and I will help you with the time. And at the end of the session, we will only collect the pink worksheet that is completed by the recorder. Here's your first task. Your first activity has two tasks, actually. At the table, once you've selected your recorder and facilitator, we'd like you to discuss, of the risk factors presented this evening, which do you believe are the three most prevalent in our community? So have a conversation as a table, and then as a table, reach a consensus on what you as a table believe are the top three in our community. Your second task within this first activity is to generate or brainstorm three actionable ways to boost protective factors related to those risk factors you identified. I'm going to give you approximately 15 minutes for this first activity. I will give you a pause, and I will give you the directions for the second activity. So to begin, you're going to focus on activity 1, task A, and task B. We'll have 15 minutes, and I will give you time prompts throughout so that we can move the conversation forward. Okay? Begin on activity 1, please. Okay, I'd like to interrupt you again. I ask you to just take a pause for just a moment. We'll let you get back to work. At this time, I'm going to ask you begin to transition to activity number 2. Activity number 2, again, has two tasks. The first task within activity 2, we're going to ask you, what additional information do you need to support individuals in our community? What are the resources you're looking for? What information is it you need? What would be helpful to you? And the second part of your activity, task B, would be, how would you like to receive that information? Recommendations to us on how we can share that information, not only with you individually, but as a greater community. So as you wrap up activity number 1, transition into activity number 2, we're looking for your feedback and input on what additional information you need to support individuals in our community and how you'd like that information to be communicated to you. So once again, we're going to start with 15 minutes. We'd like an opportunity to have some table report outs. We are going to honor our time commitment. So I will check in with you at 8:30. We will plan to try to be done with activity number 2 by 8:35. If we need to extend it, I'll let you know at 8:30. But please transition to activity 2. Thank you. Great, thank you. So we have 3 microphones that we'll move throughout the tables. We'll kind of move table to table. Again, ask that you have a tent on your table regarding the working together agreements that we shared at the beginning of the work activity. Again, the directions, we're going to ask you to be kind of brief in your comments so that we have time to hear from each table, a comment from each table. There will be someone that will bring a mic to your table. Your spokesperson should stand and speak. Share with us the one point that you want to share, either a risk factor prevalent in our community, a protective factor that we should build, or a resource that you need. And then an administrator will then collect the pink sheet from you so that we make sure we have those and we can create our executive summary. And so with that, our first microphone is walking away from us, so we'll go ahead to our second microphone with Mr. Freund right here and somebody right over here, and then Mrs. Voice will be next.
So our table talked about under protective factors, we talked about our table more education on mental health for both parents and students.
Can we do the first activity? Yeah, okay. In the, our group felt that we have too much testing, so we should have less testing, and too much homework. So in a nutshell.
A risk factor that we discussed was social media and how it creates a false sense of community for children.
We talked about a risk factor of lack of education for both adults and teens as far as understanding what to do and how to cope with situations.
We were happy to hear that there were 2 programs that have worked effectively in reducing suicides. Can we start implementing those here or learn more about them?
We talked about what our presenter talked about. It's okay to fail, and if you fail, that doesn't mean you're a failure. That the expectations sometimes in the community are so high that students feel if they don't meet that certain expectation.
We also talked a lot about educating schools, parents, families, and children, so increasing prevention education, risk factors going into it being stress, teen dating violence, and social media pressures, and having some more education opportunities for everyone.
We talked about risk factors, specifically those around getting into college, like you have to have a 36 on the ACT, double 800s on the SAT, take them multiple times, do all AP classes, honors, get straight A's, activities of such as sports, community service, and just kind of on, visiting colleges, writing essays, that they feel severe, overwhelming emotional pain and distress.
We talked about that too, but one of the things we also talked about was the systemic barriers to the least restrictive resources, and we really felt as a table that we did not know the complete complement of resources available to deal with mental health issues in the community, and maybe that's because of a stigma attached to it.
Our table right here, we have some families who recently moved to the U.S., so they still have language barriers. Jackie was able to give us a brief but very helpful overview of all the school and community resources we have. But these families, they want to know if there's any way school district could provide more help to families with language barrier.
One of the things we wanted to share was one of the protective factors that we all felt really strongly about here, and that a lot of the social and emotional stuff is happening in the elementary schools and through the curriculum, but the parents are not being integrated into it to actually have activities where it's parent-child together in the schools.
We focused on a lot of what other people have already mentioned, but we focused a lot on starting with the freshmen in the high school, making sure that we're focusing on social emotional learning, and also reaching out to the students and parents with that, starting with orientation.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the stigmas that are associated with mental health, and we thought it'd be really great to have more communication, more community involvement in discussions, and even doing something like what we did a few years ago with like a Chris Herron to come in and talk to the kids, but have that person be more about suicide or more about mental health issues.
We talked a lot about some of the pressures that students face on a daily basis, and some of the supports that we thought would be helpful would be placing on the district portal information around social media, updates on that, so parents are better able to follow and navigate that for them, as well as providing maybe conversations for a wide variety of age ranges so that they can have those conversations if their child's in need.
Our table talked a lot about the protective factors and kind of making sure that we make time for this discussion, especially as students. We are in school for 7 hours a day, and sometimes it's not always about academics, it's about the social and emotional things that you feel at school, and sometimes we have to sit down and actually make the time for learning those things.
We discussed educating parents as far as resources available in the schools and community to support their children at home where there may be social, emotional needs that are not being met. And also we asked questions about the social, emotional curriculum, and that perhaps that would be a way of questioning children who may have problems that could be communicated through perhaps a survey or questionnaire. And then also, how can we educate parents more about District 203's SEL curriculum, K through 12, so they have a better understanding of what this instruction looks like.
Our table, excuse me, I'm sorry. Our table wanted to echo the concerns about social media, and the protective factor that we wanted to propose was providing learning to both parents and students together, kind of in a Focus 203 type setting related to responsible consummation of technology.
Our table talked about a lot of the same things you guys did around the mental health education and some of the other factors. One of the things we talked about, though, is if we're going to really change the culture, we have to eliminate the stigma and put the conversation up front, largely in the schools and in front of the kids, and empower them with how they can actually have these dialogues and how they can recognize the risk factors and how they can feel comfortable navigating that space with their friends, since they are, as you mentioned, they spend 7-8 hours a day outside of the home, so we can support it in the home. But how are we going to ensure that our schools are helping as a partner to support that education as the children face it in a day-to-day life?
We also talked about mental health and the stigma around that, especially with a lot of parents feeling judged if they would admit to issues. And so just to talk as a protective factor, more openness to differences in our community. And people at our table were very heartened by the turnout tonight and how they feel very supported and less isolated even by seeing this huge group of people. Well done.
We had talked about a lot of the same things that the other tables had talked about, but the main focus of our discussion when we were going through it was on risk factors, primarily related to things like substance abuse and the problems with prescription medications that are easily available in the community. So that kind of led us into natural discussions about what the community can do to start to curtail the availability of those things, develop some education, and work on reducing overall substance abuse problems.
We focused on the interpersonal conflicts with social isolation. We feel that they're woven together due to technological advances with social media. We'd like to implement some kind of a screening system for our students that's mandatory for every student coming into the district that can report back data, and do this every quarter with every student.
Hi, we talked about how we would like to know if there's data on the effects of social media and how it relates to suicide, and if there's a way to have parent-child seminars and discussions so that the kids would not feel that they're the only ones talking about a certain topic, that they know they're not alone, so that they come to something like this, like another group said, they would know they're not the only one that is feeling that way.
We talked about the importance of adults working with kids, modeling interpersonal conflict and how you overcome that, and that it's typical, even for adults, to struggle through conflict, and how can we show kids strategies in order to do that.
Can't add anything new to what everybody else has said here already, but substance abuse was something that came up with ours, as long as the intersection, as well as the intersection of social media and interpersonal relationships and the importance of that. I think the other preventative action is the positive relationship building that we can help our students have on a daily basis.
There's a recognition at our table about the amount of immediate mental health care available, that often that there are families who might be seeking mental health treatment for a child, particularly with a psychiatrist, and because the lack of the number of providers in the community, they have to wait weeks or months, which pushes the problem along.
We talked about a lot of what everyone is saying, but to go one step farther, the connection between the community, the parents, and the schools. These things are great, but I've gone to like all of them, and I'm sometimes remarked like how few parents actually come. So what we kind of talked about is building it into the curriculum, like in orientation, we sit and we learn about PE, we learn about all this stuff. So incorporating something like that into the school system, that not that the school is responsible for, but that the parent and the child get, like everyone else has said, at the same time. And I'd also like when they're covering something, the social emotional skills, I think it's great that that's part of the curriculum. But I also think when something really important is happening that the parents need to be know about so that they can continue the conversation at home.
We spoke about the disconnection in relationships and how that's existed with social media and before social media happened. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about what do we do moving forward. So making sure that our schools, our faith communities, and our community organizations are putting out the same message so that our young people are hearing it in every setting. And thinking about taking this beyond just a conversation tonight, how do we put some teeth into this? Thinking about what other community groups, what other populations in our community aren't represented tonight, so how do they get to be included in the conversation?
I want to echo what was already said about the lack of clear communication from the district or from the community. And we were talking about that we wanted a clear starting point for a family in need, whether it be a website or a handout or even a insert into the beginning of the year like packet that all parents get.
So I am a student here at Naperville Central, and our group came up with a similar consensus as this group, which was that it would really help to have a sort of survey for students like me to take periodically, which would ask about our social and emotional health, and this can be given to teachers so they're aware of certain students and what each student is struggling with so that teachers can help us personally.
We were discussing for one of the protective factors of having perhaps like a dedicated room for mental health, and something besides just the psychologist or the social worker at the school, but that would also incorporate like the nonprofits in the area and other, just more of a resources for mental health, so that to help you know where to go, whether it's, you know, dealing with like Kids Matters and Youth 360, other things in the area, not, you know, besides the school, or just resources just to help guide you, whether it's, you know, okay, we recommend, you know, if you need to see a therapist, or if you need to, you know, what you're looking for. So, but like kind of one place that would help you encompass and figure out where to go.
And we have pink sheets from every table. Fantastic, thank you. You know, I'd like to ask that you just take a moment and you know, a comment was made in the back here about, you know, I mentioned at the opening, this is our 37th Focus 203 Community Engagement Session. Aside from our very first one, done in 2014, this is probably our largest single audience. And I appreciate you being here tonight to be a part of this conversation with us and with the community. You know, one thing that I want to share with you that you may or may not know is that as a community, we have really thought about how we can partner, how we can work together. It's one of the recommendations Dr. Singer shared as a recommendation for communities is the importance of collaboration. And a community steering committee has been formed in Naperville to look at this issue and to have these conversations, and many of those to ensure that this group has as much relevant information to support you and to serve your needs as possible. We will be certain to share this information that we've collected from you this evening with them. And as you've noted, we have recorded this presentation so that we have it available to us so that we can capture the spirit of it. In addition to his well, let's back up for a second. Dr. Singer's in the back. Please join me again in thanking him for being with us this evening. At the beginning, he had a picture of his book, and he made a comment about not doing a commercial for his book, but I will tell you, most of my administrative team has read that book and had conversations about a lot of the recommendations and things that are in there. And I would like to share with you, not only is Dr. Singer here this evening to present to you, he is partnering with the district to look at our practices, to look at our procedures, and compare them to best practices and evidence-based research practices that are out there, and to do a gap analysis of our practices and procedures versus evidence-based best practice. And we'll report those things to us. So in addition to the feedback that you've provided, we'll have feedback from an expert in the field to look at our practices and procedures to ensure that we are supporting you, our community, but most importantly, supporting our kids. This evening when you came in, this information is included in your slide deck, but as you leave this evening, we're also going to provide you with some additional information. You'll have a packet of information that includes Chapter 12 of Dr. Singer's book on suicide in schools, which provides information about resources available, but then also information about local resources that we have. This presentation will be repeated tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. at Maison Sabika, and I am really hoping for another crowd just like this one. So if you know of somebody who could benefit from this conversation or has information to share with us, please go home tonight and encourage them to join us tomorrow morning, 9:30 to 11:30 at Maison Sabika. And as mentioned at the beginning, and is customary with all of our Focus 203 sessions, the executive summary and information will be posted on our website. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you as a community. Thank you so much for your commitment to the kids in this town and being here this evening. Have a safe evening.